Hi guys, welcome back. This is lecture 4-13. So in this lecture, we're going to wrap up chapter 15. And you might remember from the last time we were talking about equilibrium and the ways that we can take a reaction that is under equilibrium control, and we can apply different types of stressors to those systems. So for example, we can change the concentration of reactants or products. We can change the temperature. We can also change the pressure for a system that is a gas system at equilibrium. And by applying those stressors, we can shift the balance out of equilibrium, and then the reaction will respond in a particular way. And that way might be something like make more product. So what I wanted to start with today is let's apply all of these concepts that we learned separately to one thing. So let's see if we can apply all of those different types of stressors in a way to affect the outcome of one particular reaction. And a great example of this is something known as the Haber-Bosch process that is used for producing ammonia all over the world. And this process, it's a very important thing for our modern civilization. Basically, if we go back to the 19th century, we see that we were sort of at the carrying capacity for our land. So all the fertilizer that we had came from animals on farms. And this was severely limiting in terms of how much food could be produced. And it was recognized that we needed to have some artificial means for fertilizing plants with nitrogen. Now the problem is that most of the nitrogen around us is in the air. It's in the form of nitrogen gas. And nitrogen gas is not what we say fixable. So it doesn't dissolve in water. Plants can't take it up as its N2 form. It's a very stable molecule. In fact, N2 gas might be one of the most stable molecules in the universe. So it was thought, well, we need to figure out a way to take this stable nitrogen that's all around us, and maybe we can somehow convert it into what we can use, which is ammonia, NH3. So here's the reaction that we're talking about. So it's known that if you can take nitrogen gas and put it in the presence of hydrogen gas, that a small amount of ammonia gas will be produced. Now, notice I said a small amount. In typical atmospheric pressures, under normal conditions, this is an extremely small amount of ammonia that would be produced from these two reactants. And that's because of different types of barriers to these two things reacting, breaking the bonds that they have already, and making the new bonds that are present in ammonia. So it does not proceed in the forward direction to an appreciable rate at all. So if we were to really represent this reaction at equilibrium, this arrow that I have shown forward would probably not look exactly like that. In fact, it would probably be better represented like this. So as far as problems go, this is a pretty good one. This is a huge unmet need that the entire world has, right? The ability to have essentially an unlimited amount of food, and then food then becomes limited just by space rather than by the soil quality in a lot of ways. It means that a lot of people can grow food that don't have access to the same types of animals. Another thing about it is that nitrogen gas and hydrogen gas, the starting materials for this very valuable substance, ammonia, are essentially free. Nitrogen gas is the most plentiful gas in our atmosphere, probably the third most plentiful gas in the universe, and it's essentially free or less than free, so you can get it anywhere. Hydrogen gas also extraordinarily inexpensive. So a chemist named Fritz Haber at the time realized this was a problem that he could solve and that was necessarily solved. And the process we call today is the Haber-Bosch process. And the idea behind how he was able to do this is shown here below. There's a little tabletop device that he made back at the time. And this device, essentially, you turn it on by flipping a switch, and it produces 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a continuous process, ammonia from nitrogen gas and hydrogen gas in excellent yields. And the question is how did he accomplish this? And that's what we're going to look at. And primarily the way he accomplished this is he identified stressors that he could apply to the system to take it from this balanced sort of dead state that it doesn't do much interesting and put it under a constant amount of stress such that it is always out of equilibrium and always producing ammonia gas. And we're going to see how we can apply what we know about equilibrium to do that. So let's turn the page and see how this works. All right, so let's talk about the three types of stressors and how we can apply them to this particular chemical system so that we can favor the production of ammonia. So the first type of stress that we learned about was change in concentration. We learned that the types of stresses in terms of concentration change can be thought of in terms of increasing or decreasing the concentration of reactants or products. So what can we do here if we want to change this reaction to drive it to the product side? Should we increase or decrease the concentration of the reactants? Well, if we want to drive the reaction forward towards the product side, that would mean we would need to increase the concentration of the reactants. So we would increase the concentration of nitrogen gas and also increase the concentration of hydrogen gas. To increase the concentration of a gas, what we do is we increase the pressure. This forces more molecules of gas into a smaller volume, thus increasing their concentration. So in the Haber design, he uses pressurized nitrogen and hydrogen gas tanks. Now, what about on the product side? If we want to drive this reaction forward to produce more ammonia, what can we do about the concentration of the product, ammonia, to make that a more favorable possibility? Well, if we apply Le Chatelier's principle to this problem, it means we need to stress the system out by removing product as it's formed. Thus, the reaction will continually make more product to reestablish equilibrium. So we need some means by which we can decrease the concentration of ammonia gas as it is formed. A good question is though, how would we remove ammonia gas from this system, right? There are three gases in a vessel: nitrogen gas, hydrogen gas, and ammonia gas. And we need to remove just the ammonia and leave the others behind. Now, the way we can do this is thinking about the differences amongst ammonia, hydrogen, and nitrogen gases. So these molecules, because they are different, should have different physical properties. And we can take advantage of those properties to separate them from one another. So for example, hydrogen gas is much lighter than nitrogen gas and ammonia gas. Also, ammonia gas has hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding gives it a much higher boiling point, which means that if we cooled this reaction vessel down, we could selectively convert one of these gases into a liquid before the others, and that would be ammonia. If we cooled this off to, say, minus 60 degrees Celsius, hydrogen and nitrogen gas would still stay in the gas state, but ammonia would convert into a liquid and essentially collect in some kind of reservoir. And that's basically the design that is in the Fritz-Haber system. Now, there are lots of chemical systems that use this kind of design. I'm just simplifying the idea here. Essentially, you have some kind of vessel that has the reaction taking place in it. And inside that vessel, you can do things like place a coiled condensing column. So this is a tube that is running some kind of refrigerant through it, some kind of cooling substance, for example, ethylene glycol that has been chilled. And the gases that condense on that coil drip down and are somehow placed in a reservoir or an exit valve. And for example, that would be here, the red dot is the ammonia gas, while the other gases there I'm showing in purple are still in the system reacting with each other. And because their concentrations remain high and the product concentration is low, they're constantly producing that ammonia gas, which continues to condense. And this is where the idea for a continuous system comes from, the ability to keep the system out of equilibrium so it's continuously producing things. It's not a batch process, it goes all the time. So let's think about beyond concentration, what we can do. What about change in temperature? To be able to answer the question how to change the temperature for a reaction to favor the formation of the products requires that we know whether or not the reaction is exo or endothermic. Once we know if the reaction is exothermic or endothermic, we know whether to cool the reaction down or heat it up to drive it forward. Now, what I'll tell you is that this reaction is exothermic. So how do we apply that knowledge to solving this problem? Well, the first thing we should do is write down the reaction. If we know it's exothermic, which side is the heat on? Now that we know that the reaction is exothermic, we realize that that means the heat must be exiting the system. And that means it is a product of the reaction, not a reactant, not a starting material, but a product. So we're going to draw the little triangle to represent heat on the product side. And now we can say if we should heat this reaction or cool it down. What do you think? Well, just like when we wanted to favor the formation of ammonia, we had to remove ammonia. If we want to favor the formation of ammonia, we also can remove heat because it is on the product side. So removing things from the product side causes the reaction to generate more of the product side. So we have to remove heat, and that means we have to cool it down. And that's actually good news, right? Because we already established that we need to chill this reaction down in a chiller to condense the ammonia. So we can actually do two things at once, to accomplish two goals at once. By cooling the reaction down, we can also condense the ammonia. So it works hand in hand. Now, let's look at the last type of stress that we can use. What about pressure? How can we change the pressure to favor the formation of ammonia? To determine the effect of a pressure change on a system of gases in terms of its equilibrium distribution, we need to consider the number of moles of gas on the product side and on the reactant side. Now, we understand that a higher pressure will correlate naturally with this side with more moles of gas. More moles of gas means higher pressure. So what we do is we add up both sides. We say on the reactant side, we have 4 moles of gas, and on the product side, we have 2 moles of gas. So which side naturally has more pressure already? Well, that would be the reactant side. The reactant side has 4 moles of gas, therefore it's a higher pressure. So if we increase the pressure on the system, right, it's stressing it out. By increasing the pressure, it needs to alleviate that extra pressure. Where does it go? It goes to the side with less pressure. So if we increase the pressure on this reaction, it responds to try to lower the pressure, producing more ammonia gas. Notice that increase in pressure also goes hand in hand with increasing the concentration of of nitrogen gas and hydrogen gas. We already established we needed to increase the pressure of those because we needed to increase their concentrations. So, kind of in summary, we cool the reaction down, we remove ammonia as it's formed, and we increase the concentration of the reactants, and therefore we drive this reaction forward. And we take a chemical system that really doesn't do much, and we turn it into sort of a chemical powerhouse. Modern day production of ammonia uses this exact same design. So massive chemical industry around this, probably the largest chemical industry on the planet is producing ammonia. So that's kind of the summary, or kind of a review also of Le Chatelier's principle. Let's go on, and we're going to learn some new stuff in the rest of this chapter. So let's turn the page. So kind of an interesting thing about this equilibrium we've been talking about. We know that the equilibrium is a balance, right? As you start at the beginning, there's all this reactant, and it gets converted into products. And eventually the reaction sort of dies out. It starts off doing a lot of stuff and then slopes downward into this place of inactivity that we're calling equilibrium. Now, what's really interesting about it is there is a constant that exists for every reaction. Each reaction has its own what's called the equilibrium constant. And what that equilibrium constant is the ratio of the products to the starting materials. So no matter if you started with 1 gram or 1,000 grams of the starting material, in the end, you'll have the same ratio as somebody else who ran the reaction on any other scale. So it's in fact a way to quantify the balance. What is it? Is it favored towards the reactants or the products? And what's that ratio? This is called the KEQ, or the equilibrium constant. And it's a ratio of the concentrations of the products to the starting materials. So let's talk about KEQ, and specifically let's talk about the possible values that you could have for it and what those would mean. So for example, what if we had a KEQ that was greater than 1? Would that mean that at the end, at equilibrium, there were more reactants or more products? So we understand that KEQ is the ratio of the concentration of products to the concentration of reactants. So therefore, if KEQ is greater than 1, that would imply that the concentration of products must be greater than the concentration of reactants. Here's an example. Say we ran a reaction, and at the end we measured the concentration of products and we determined it was 3 molar. We also measured the concentration of reactants and determined they were 1 molar. We could do that experiment by titration. We can then calculate KEQ by dividing the concentration of the products, which is 3 molar, by the concentration of reactants, which is 1 molar, and we get 3.00 as KEQ. What that tells us is that there are 3 times as many products as there are reactants. So we can summarize all of this for a general reaction. Let's say we had A and B, where B is the product, A is the starting material, and let's say KEQ is greater than 1. It would mean that this reaction was product favored. So when we draw the equilibrium arrows, they show a larger arrow drawn towards the product than the one drawn towards the starting material. This is for KEQ is greater than 1. So if we saw a question like the one below, which is, example, if KEQ is equal to 3, is the reaction favoring the left, the reactant side, or the right, the product side? We would definitely be able to say it was the right or the product side, because we know that KEQ being greater than 1 means that the reaction is product favored. Let's go to number 2 down below. Let's say we had a value of KEQ that was less than 1. Are there more reactants or are there more products? So if we have a KEQ value that is less than 1, that implies that the concentration of the products must be less than the concentration of the reactants at equilibrium. So for example, we can reverse the situation we have above. Instead of having a concentration of products of 3 molar, let's make it 1 molar, and let's have the concentration of reactants set to 3 molar instead. So when we calculate KEQ for this, we have 1 molar divided by 3 molar, which gives us 0.333 molar with 3 significant figures. Now, what does this say about our product versus starting material distribution? Well, this shows us that the reaction is reactant favored. So we draw a small arrow towards the product and we leave a larger arrow back towards the reactant. This is when KEQ is less than 1. It is reactant favored. Now what we're going to do on the next page is look at one more scenario. What if KEQ is equal to 1? And then we will look at some specific kind of examples of real reactions and what their KEQs would look like. We're not going to be doing any more than that. We're just looking at sort of a general sense. What does it mean? Big picture stuff. So let's finish that up on the next page. So what does it mean if we had a KEQ that is equal to 1? What does that say about the ratio of the products and the reactants? Well, what it implies is that they have to be exactly equal to each other. The only way we can get a KEQ of 1 is when that happens. So this would be like a reaction that exactly 50% of the reactants was formed from the products. So there's a 1-to-1 ratio of them. And this, you can imagine, is not exactly the most common situation for a reaction to perfectly go 50%. So that's what the theoretical KEQ is equal to 1 means. We have the same amount. So while it's not exactly likely that you would have a KEQ is equal to exactly 1, it is very likely that a lot of reactions have KEQs that are close to 1. And these are reactions that generally are neither forward nor reverse favored. They're sort of equally distributed between the products and the starting materials. And that's a very common situation to have. Okay, so now that we've talked about KEQ and what the different values mean, how would we actually write out a KEQ expression for some reaction that has multiple products and multiple reactants? So something like a more complicated than A and B. So for example, let's say we had a reaction that had some number of starting materials like A and B, and this could go on, but let's just try this one with just A and B, and then products C and D. And let's also imagine these reactants and products had coefficients from balancing. So I'll use subscripts A for a coefficient of capital A and lowercase b for the starting material capital B, and so on and so forth. Now, how would we write the equilibrium expression for something like this? And that would be a general KEQ expression. So the way we write the equilibrium constant for this general reaction form with more than one reactant and more than one product is we take the ratios again, but but this time we multiply the concentrations together. So on the product side, we multiply the concentrations of each of the products together. And then on the reactant side, we multiply those concentrations together. We also have to take into account the coefficients. We use those as exponents on the concentration for the starting material of the product that they belong to. So that's the general form for KEQ for any general reaction that we might have between any number of starting materials and any number of products. So let's try and apply that. We're going to write the KEQ expression for water vapor being formed from hydrogen gas and oxygen gas. So let's just first start out with the reaction. So we've got hydrogen gas, which is H2, and we've got oxygen gas, also diatomic, so O2. And then our forward arrow will go to water, and let's keep it as a gas. And then the coefficients need to be balanced, so that has 2 to make oxygen even, and then we need 4 total hydrogens, so that's our balanced equation. So let's go ahead and write the equilibrium constant, KEQ. So our product is water, and we would need the concentration of that water raised to the second power because of the 2 coefficient. And then on the reactant side, we've got the concentration of hydrogen gas raised to the second power, and then that's multiplied by the concentration of oxygen gas. And we want to actually make sure we keep that reactant operation sort of its own priority calculation, so we put it in parentheses. And that would be the expression that we would use to calculate KEQ. Of course, we would need to measure all of these things, which would not be necessarily an easy task to get all of those different concentrations after the reaction, but if you could, you'd be able to write the KEQ expression. And that's what experimentalists that are working with new reactions will do to establish an equilibrium constant. They will measure those concentrations, find what the KEQ expression would be, and then plug the numbers in. We're definitely not doing that. We just want to know how we would do it if we could. So that's the idea. Let's try another one. Let's write this one below. Let's write the reaction and KEQ expression for nitrogen and hydrogen gas reacting to form ammonia gas. Okay, so we get our balanced chemical equation, and now we can write KEQ. Okay, so that's basically what we need to know about the equilibrium constant, KEQ. Kind of most important concepts are the values. So it's like if KEQ is greater than 1, that means it's a product favored. If it's less than 1, it's reactant favored. And if it's close to 1, it's not really favored strongly in either direction. Next, what we're going to look at is a version of KEQ. It's called Ka, or the acid dissociation constant. It's a acid-specific K that we use. So let's turn the page, and we will wrap up our equilibrium topic with that. So acids have their own version of KEQ that's specific to the Bronsted-Lowry definition of an acid. So let's write out that Bronsted-Lowry definition of an acid real quick and then see what this KEQ, but specifically for acids, really means. So the Bronsted-Lowry definition of an acid is all about proton exchange, and an acid is defined as some substance that has a proton that is able to be donated. So we'll call it HA. So when HA acts like an acid, the A gives up a proton to become A-, which is known as the conjugate base. Now, we could write a KEQ expression based on this result, where the products are the proton and the conjugate base. The reactant would just be the Bronsted acid, HA. So let's go ahead and do that and write KEQ for this. So this is the equilibrium expression for a typical Bronsted acid. Now, acids and bases are not only very important, but the KEQ can be readily determined for them because it's relatively easy to discover the concentration of H plus, because we can use that pH calculation to figure it out, but also the concentration of HA is easily known as well. So this is actually rebranded. It's not really called KEQ for acids, but instead it's called Ka. So while it's not really anything special or new, it's definitely something we should make sure we can express for some various acids. Let's take a look at hydrofluoric acid. Hydrofluoric acid is HF. So how would we write the Ka expression for this acid? All that's required is for us to recognize that HF would dissociate into H plus and F minus, and then we would write Ka based on the products, which are H plus and F minus. That would be on the top, multiplied together, and then divided by HF on the bottom. So now that we see that Ka is very much analogous to KEQ, can we answer this question, which is, should strong acids or weak acids have a larger value for Ka, and why? So this is a good question. Let's just kind of apply our standard logic to it. So we know that Ka is the ratio of the ions or the product to the unionized form or the starting material. So if we think about this in terms of KEQ, if we had some acid 1 and it ionized into H and A minus, where it was product favored, we would have a Ka greater than 1. But if we had a second acid that was reactant favored, that would have a Ka of less than 1. So it seems like the stronger acid here, the one that goes forward more, has a larger value of Ka. So in general, that's true. Stronger acids have larger values of Ka. And in fact, we define a strong acid as an acid that has a Ka that is greater than 1. A weak acid is one that has a Ka that is less than 1. So let's look at this table. We have several acids. There are 4 acids. We have their Ka values, and we want to rank them from the strongest with number 1 to the weakest with number 4. So go ahead and give that a try and see if you can rank these correctly. So looking at the values, we can see that these Ka values are all less than 1. So these are all weak acids. And we have a few there that are very weak acids. So let's try to find the weakest one. You'll notice that hydrogen cyanide, HCN, has a value of 4.0 times 10 to the negative 10th power. So that's definitely the weakest acid. So let's rank that at 4. And then we go up from there. The next value we run into going up would be this acetic acid that has a negative 5th power. So that would be the next one up. We would rank that at 3. And then it's really a split for HF and this formic acid. They both have powers that are 10 to the minus 4. The larger one will have a stronger acid. So we have to find the value that's larger, and that would be this hydrofluoric acid, which is 6.7 times 10 to the minus 4. That would be the strongest. And then the second strongest would be this formic acid with 1.8 times 10 to the minus 4. So that is the Ka, or the acid dissociation constant, or acid equilibrium constant. And it's a useful value. It's experimentally, it's easy to get at because we have pH meters, which indirectly measure the concentration of the proton in the solution. So it can be determined relatively easily in any lab. So we're going to move on from this now, and we're going to wrap up on the last page with some information about something known as a reaction coordinate diagram. So it's very different from KEQ. It's kinetics rather than equilibrium. But it's very interesting. So let's go to the next page. So let's talk about reaction coordinate diagrams. And the first thing I want to mention is reaction coordinate diagrams, super useful tool in chemistry, one of probably my favorite tools, actually, and something we use all the time in undergraduate classes, but also in like high-end research, in papers that we publish. Super useful thing. For that reason, I probably have a slight bias towards them, and definitely you want to make sure you're good with this information. I tend to ask at least a couple of questions on these on the exam based on concepts. What a reaction coordinate diagram is a visual graph-like picture Usually when it's drawn by people, it's in 2 dimensions, and it shows the energy change, how the energy changes as a reaction proceeds. So what we do is we show a graph with the y-axis being energy, and then the x-axis being the reaction progress, moving, if we go from left to right, that's forward progress, and if we go from right to left, that's backwards progress or reverse progress. And we see how the energy changes as we go along that x-axis. So if we look at this example, if we have a reaction that is the starting material is A and the product is B, the energy of A can be determined experimentally through various experiments and then plotted on this graph at some correct coordinate. And that's when the reaction progress is at 0. Now, as the reaction proceeds forward, A is changed in such a way that its energy is raised. And we'll talk about what that means. This location here is sort of the maximum point of energy in the reaction, and we'll talk, that has a special name. And then we'll see that the reaction starts to go downhill as the reaction proceeds forwards towards the product B. And then as A gets converted into B, at the end, the reaction progress stops and B has some energy. You'll notice that it happens to be, in this case, lower than A, which is not always the case. So there are some different parts to this graph. It shows different information. It can relay whether a reaction is endothermic or exothermic. It can relate how steep the transition is from the starting materials to the products. It can also relate how a catalyst can affect the course of the reaction, and it can relate how many steps a reaction is. This reaction is 1 step. A reaction that was 2 steps would have a different look to it. So these are all sort of basic concepts with reaction coordinate diagrams. Let's talk about a few simple aspects of it. First, we're going to talk about exothermic versus endothermic reactions and how they would look on an energy reaction coordinate diagram. So let's think about what a reaction coordinate diagram would look like and how it would be different if it was exothermic reaction versus endothermic reaction. So whenever we draw a reaction coordinate diagram, we're going to set up our energy on the y-axis and our progress on the x-axis. And the first one I want to talk about is the exothermic. So if we have an exothermic reaction, we need to figure out which would have a higher energy on this reaction coordinate diagram, the starting materials or the products. So let's think about that for a minute. If we had a starting material, say A, turning into B, and it was exothermic, what's going on with the energy? Well, exothermic means that this reaction is producing energy. So that means energy must be being released. So if we're starting at a higher energy, that's possible. If we go from a high energy to a low energy, that means we must be releasing energy. That would be an exothermic reaction. So an exothermic reaction has a curve where A has a higher energy as a starting material and B has a lower energy. And the curve shape always has the same general format. As A transforms into B, the first thing it does is it goes up over a hill and then it decreases in energy down to B. Now, what would the reaction coordinate diagram for an endothermic reaction look like? In an endothermic reaction, the starting material, which I'm calling A prime, absorbs heat in its transition to B prime. So that means B prime has more energy than A prime. So that would mean the starting materials have less energy than the products. So when we see a graph or plot a reaction coordinate diagram for an endothermic reaction, A prime is always lower in energy than B prime. Now, as A prime converts into B prime, it also has to climb up an energy barrier, a hill, first to reach some maximum energy before then declining back down to the slightly lower in energy B prime. Now, there are a few parts to these graphs that we need to describe. The first is the energy change, actually, in going from A to B, or A prime to B prime. So if we can find the value of energy for A, and we can find the energy value for B, we can calculate a delta value for those. So we subtract the energy of B from the energy of A, and we get something called delta H of the reaction, otherwise known as the heat of reaction, or otherwise known as the enthalpy for a reaction. And this tells us how much heat would be released in the case of an exothermic reaction, but it would also tell us the amount of heat that would be absorbed in an endothermic reaction. So that's delta H for a reaction. Now, there's another part to the reaction coordinate diagrams that we need to talk about, which is this hill that the reaction has to go over as it proceeds from the starting materials to the products. So we have this hill. What is its origin? What is its significance? Why is it there? So in any chemical reaction, we're of course forming new bonds. But what we have to do before we form new bonds is we have to break the old ones. So here's an example. Let's say we had A bonded to A and another molecule B bonded to B. And we wanted to make a molecule where A was not bonded to A anymore, but in fact is bonded to B. The first thing that has to happen is the bonds between A and A have to break, and the bonds between B and B also have to break. This bond breaking costs energy. We have to invest energy into this to break the bonds. Now, when the new bonds are formed, these A to B bonds, that energy is released. And that's where the energy return comes from. So bond breaking costs energy and bond making returns it. So back at our reaction coordinate diagram, the part of the curve leading up to the maximum point is where the bond breaking or the energy investment comes from. That's the energy cost associated with breaking bonds. Now we get to that maximum point. That maximum point is called the transition state. It is the literal transition between when we're breaking bonds in the starting materials, the transition between that and making bonds to the products. So the second part of the curve is the bond making process where energy is returned. So using this information, it's quite easy to explain why endothermic reactions require more energy than they give off. It's because it costs more energy to break the bonds than is returned in going from the transition state to the products. So there's more of an investment, a cost associated with the return. Now, another interesting feature about reaction coordinate diagrams is they allow us to design new ways of making a reaction proceed from reactants to products. So as I mentioned earlier, if we go from A to B and say in this hypothetical exothermic reaction, there's this maximum energy point called the transition state. And this transition state is the exact midway point between the starting materials and the products. Now, if you were interested in having a reaction go faster, what you would need to do is lower the energy of the transition state that it went through. And this is the origin of what a catalyst does. A catalyst is a chemical species that is in the reaction mixture that somehow interacts with the starting materials to lower the transition state. What it does is it provides a new transition state, a different transition state that the reaction can proceed through that is lower in energy. So a reaction can go through a lower energy transition and is therefore faster. Just like if you were going on a hike and you wanted to get home quicker, you could take a different route that had less vertical climb. This is exactly the same concept. So a catalyst you've used already this semester was potassium iodide. You might remember it accelerated the reaction, the decomposition of hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen gas. And what that potassium iodide does is it provides a different pathway for the molecule to undergo that decomposition, a different transition state. Chemists that work in research are often designing catalysts based on this process, and what they try to do is identify the three-dimensional molecular structure of that transition state, the original one, and try to find ways of lowering it. So that's the basic idea with reaction coordinate diagrams. Kind of big picture stuff is knowing about the different curves for exothermic, endothermic, understanding what a catalyst does in a reaction is it lowers the energy of the transition state, and there's the activation barrier, where that comes from, the breaking bonds, and the other side of it is from the bond making. So that concludes this lecture 4-13. I hope you have a good weekend. Let me know if you have any questions.